The year was 1305, and London's streets echoed with the cries of vendors hawking their wares and the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone. But on this August morning, a different sound would soon fill the air, the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd, gathering to witness what would become one of history's most notorious executions. The man they came to see die was William Wallace, the rebel knight whose name had become a rallying cry for freedom and a symbol of defiance against the mighty English crown. Every step he took toward the place of his death was watched with a mixture of awe, hatred, and dread. Some saw him as a traitor, deserving of the cruelest punishment imaginable. Others whispered his name with reverence, knowing that his courage had shaken England to its core. The weight of chains clinked against his body as soldiers dragged him forward, their eyes fixed straight ahead, unwilling to meet his gaze. Wallace was broken in flesh, but not in spirit. The streets of London were lined with thousands. Men, women, and even children pressed forward, their faces twisted in excitement, as though the spectacle of a man's suffering were some grand festival. They had heard whispers of what was to come, whispers of a punishment so brutal that it was designed not just to kill, but to erase a man's very memory, to turn his rebellion into a warning carved into the hearts of all who watched. Yet, as Wallace's towering figure appeared, battered but unbowed, silence fell for a moment. Here was no ordinary man. Here was a symbol, a warrior who had dared to stand against a king, who had tasted victory against impossible odds. His body might have been shackled, but his presence was larger than life, and even those who spat curses at his name could not deny the chill that ran through them as he passed. What awaited him that day was not a simple death. It was a death crafted for terror, a ritual of humiliation and torment that would stretch the limits of human endurance. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to suffer a fate reserved only for the most despised of enemies, traitors against the crown. And William Wallace was to be made the example above all others. As the crowd surged and jostled for a better view, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary execution. This was a spectacle of power, designed to crush not only Wallace, but the very idea of rebellion itself. What followed would sear itself into history, a moment so horrifying that it would echo across centuries, whispered in the shadows as a reminder of what happens when one man dares to defy an empire. And so, the question lingers: was William Wallace's death truly the end of his cause, or was it the beginning of something far greater? The land of Scotland at the close of the 13th century bore scars that were not merely carved into its soil, but into the souls of its people. Rolling green hills that once sang with the laughter of clans now whispered with silence, broken only by the tramp of foreign boots and the cries of the dispossessed. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with the smoke of burnt homes and the faint, iron tang of blood spilled in countless villages. To outsiders, Scotland was a conquered nation, a restless territory forced under the crushing weight of English dominion. But to those who lived upon its soil, it was a daily theatre of humiliation and cruelty, a stage upon which the English crown acted out its domination with ruthless precision. The occupation was not merely military, it was cultural, psychological, and racial. The Scots were not treated as fellow Christians, fellow subjects, or even fellow men in the eyes of the English lords. Instead, they were cast as barbarians, crude and uncivilized, barely human in the hierarchy of the empire's gaze. Their language was mocked, their customs derided, their faith desecrated. The English crown demanded more than submission of the body. It sought the submission of the spirit, the slow grinding down of an entire people until they saw themselves as inferior, until rebellion became unthinkable. Every policy, every act of taxation, every sneering insult hurled by English officials served the same purpose: to remind the Scots that they were not equals, but a conquered race, undeserving of dignity. The streets of Scottish towns bore witness to this degradation. Merchants who once thrived found their goods seized without payment, forced into poverty, while English officials grew fat on stolen wealth. Families who had tilled their ancestral lands for generations were evicted, their fields handed over to foreign landlords who demanded rents they could never pay. hunger became an unrelenting companion, stalking hearths where children went to sleep with hollow stomachs and mothers wept at their own helplessness. In villages, English soldiers patrolled not merely as protectors of law, but as predators cloaked in authority. They barged into homes at will, stripping away not only possessions, but dignity itself. To resist was to invite punishment, public beatings, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, perhaps the most crushing weight was not the violence itself, but the atmosphere of contempt in which it was delivered. The English rulers did not simply wield power, they revelled in it, taking pleasure in the degradation of those they saw as lesser. A Scottish farmer forced to kneel in the mud before a sneering soldier, a young woman's cries drowned by the laughter of her captors, an elder mocked for speaking his own tongue. These were not random acts, but the living theatre of domination. Racism was weaponized to justify every cruelty, painting the Scots as savages who could not govern themselves, thus deserving the chains fastened around their necks. For the Scots, daily life became an act of endurance. To walk the road was to endure insults. To enter the market was to endure unfair levies. To speak in one's own tongue was to risk derision or worse. The humiliation was constant, a steady erosion of identity designed to strip away pride and replace it with submission. And yet beneath this surface, beneath the bowed heads and silent suffering, something darker simmered. Rage, the kind of rage that builds not in sudden explosions, but in slow, smouldering embers. The kind of rage that waits silently for a single breath of wind to become flame. The Scottish countryside, once alive with the rhythm of clan life, now felt like a body in mourning. Villages that had thrived for centuries found themselves hollowed out, their men conscripted into forced labour or dragged away in chains to English prisons. Fields that had once yielded barley, oats and rye now bore the blackened stumps of scorched earth campaigns, punishment for villages suspected of harbouring rebels. Smoke often rose in the distance, not the gentle smoke of hearths preparing meals, but the acrid smoke of homes torched as warnings. The message was clear. Loyalty was demanded, not earned, and any whisper of defiance would be answered with fire. Children grew up in this shadow of fear, their earliest memories shaped not by tales of kinship or tradition, but by the sight of English banners fluttering in the wind. To them, the English soldier was not an occasional presence, but an unavoidable, constant, the faceless enforcer of rules that seemed designed to crush spirit and hope. A boy might watch his father beaten for failing to bow deeply enough, while a girl might learn too early the price of being noticed by men in uniform. These cruelties did not need to be spoken aloud. They were carved into the fabric of daily life. Silence became a survival strategy. Religious life, too, was poisoned by the invaders. Churches had long been centres of strength for the Scots, places where faith anchored communities through hardship. But the English crown understood the power of the pulpit and sought to bend it to its will. Priests who resisted were replaced with those loyal to England, and sermons often shifted from words of hope to messages of obedience. Ancient relics of Scottish saints were carted away, sent to English cathedrals as trophies. Sacred sites that had given the people pride were desecrated, not only to plunder their wealth, but to strip away the symbols of a shared identity. Even the faith of the Scots was turned against them, twisted into a weapon of control. The deeper cruelty lay in the calculated use of racial superiority as justification. To the English rulers, the Scots were not simply political opponents. They were an other, a lesser breed to be dominated and corrected. Chronicles penned in London describe them as wild, brutish, incapable of governing themselves. These words were not idle insults. They were ideological armour, a narrative that gave moral cover to every atrocity committed. When English soldiers torched villages or butchered rebels, they were not murdering fellow men in their minds. They were pacifying savages. Racism made cruelty seem righteous, and conquest seem like salvation. This was not simply war. It was a campaign of erasure, one that sought to rewrite the very worth of the Scottish people. Yet beneath this cruelty lay a paradox the English crown could not extinguish. The harder they pressed, the deeper the scars, the more enduring the resentment. A people stripped of everything but dignity become dangerous when even dignity is denied. Around fires at night, whispered stories carried memories of freedom, of ancient battles where Scots had stood proudly as their own masters. Elders reminded children that they were not beasts, not savages, but heirs of warriors and clans who had walked these lands long before an English crown ever dared to claim dominion. These whispers were fragile, spoken in secret, but they endured. And in those whispers lived the seeds of rebellion, waiting for a man, or perhaps many men, to give them voice. The markets, once bustling centres of exchange where clans met to barter livestock, wool and grain, had transformed into stages of exploitation. English officials stationed themselves at every stall, exacting taxes so steep that even the most prosperous merchants teetered on ruin. A Scottish woman selling wool might find half her earnings snatched by the crown's collectors, leaving her with barely enough to feed her family. If she protested, even softly, she risked being accused of insubordination or treason. Punishments were often performed in public to amplify their message. Whippings in the square, stocks erected for days of humiliation, or in the worst cases, executions staged as entertainment. These acts were not simply to maintain order, they were spectacles of dominance, crafted to remind every onlooker that resistance was not only futile but fatal. The psychological weight of such treatment was immense. Generations of Scots who had grown up with independence now found themselves reduced to subjects who measured their words and movements with constant fear. A farmer leading his cattle through the streets kept his head low, not from humility, but to avoid catching the gaze of a soldier who might interpret eye contact as defiance. Mothers warned their children never to speak too loudly in public, never to complain, never to forget that the walls themselves seemed to carry English ears. Children learned caution before they learned courage. They grew into adults who understood that survival depended not only on skill or labor, but on submission. This was how conquest worked its deepest wounds, not through the blade, but through the reshaping of identity, until people began to wonder if perhaps the conquerors were right about their inferiority. But not all bent quietly. Across the rugged highlands and valleys, there remained men and women who carried within them an unshakable pride, a conviction that their people's spirit could not be broken by chains. They looked at the soldiers with loathing, at the English courts with contempt, at the stolen lands with sorrow and fury. Their resistance was often small, a loaf of bread smuggled to a starving family, an insult muttered under breath, a hidden dagger clutched in case of opportunity. But each act carried risk, and each risk carried meaning. Resistance became a form of identity, a way of silently declaring, "We are not yet conquered." These acts of defiance, though scattered, frightened the crown more than open rebellion. Open rebellion could be crushed with armies, but the spirit of a people, their refusal to see themselves as lesser, was harder to extinguish. And so, punishments grew ever harsher. English justiciars travelled the land, holding courts that were little more than ceremonies of intimidation. Trials were rigged, verdicts predetermined, and the accused, usually Scots, paraded as warnings to others. Even when evidence was absent, guilt was assumed, for the mere fact of being Scottish was itself a mark of suspicion. In this way, oppression deepened the lines of division, transforming subjects into outcasts within their own homeland. And yet, amid this theatre of cruelty, an undercurrent of destiny seemed to stir. The Scots did not yet know it, but the soil was preparing a man who would embody their rage, their sorrow, and their undying will to be free. The greater the weight of oppression, the more powerful the force that would one day rise against it. In every village burned, in every child beaten, in every elder mocked, the story of Scotland's future was being written in suffering. It was not a question of if rebellion would come, but when, and who would be the voice to ignite it. The land itself seemed to cry beneath the weight of occupation. Roads that had once carried merchants and pilgrims now bore only the boots of soldiers. Their presence a reminder that every path, every crossing, every market square belonged to the crown. Castles once belonging to Scottish lords flew the English banner, towering symbols of domination carved against the skyline. For those who gazed upon them from the valleys below, they were not fortresses of protection, but prisons of the imagination, looming reminders that Scotland's sovereignty had been stolen brick by brick. Even the rivers, once lifelines of trade, carried barges heavy with tribute flowing southward, Scotland's lifeblood siphoned away to feed the coffers of London. And yet, no empire, however mighty, can erase memory. In the hushed tones of elders, around hearthfires, the stories of Scotland's proud past endured. They told of warriors who had defended their lands with valour, of clans who had stood unbroken against invaders long before the English claimed superiority. These stories were dangerous, whispered in shadows, but they burned like embers in the minds of children who listened wide-eyed. Each tale was a reminder that Scotland had not always been a land of chains, and that the humiliation of the present need not define the destiny of the future. To the English, these were mere myths, the fanciful dreams of a broken people. But to the Scots, they were seeds, small, fragile, but capable of taking root in the soil of despair. By 1305, Scotland was a nation standing at a precipice. Its people were battered, humiliated, and divided, yet beneath the surface lay a storm-gathering force. The English crown believed it had extinguished all possibility of rebellion, but in truth, it had sown the conditions for its own reckoning. Oppression breeds silence for a time, but silence is not surrender. It is the slow inhale before the shout, the tightening of a bow before release. Every insult, every stolen coin, every act of cruelty was a spark thrown onto a gathering pile of kindling, and when that fire came, it would not be easily quenched. In this crucible of suffering, the story of William Wallace would emerge, not as a tale of one man alone, but as the embodiment of an entire people's rage against the chains that sought to bind them. William Wallace's story did not begin in the thunder of battle or in the echo of steel against steel, but in the quiet struggles of a boy born into a land where freedom was little more than a memory. He came into the world in the shadow of occupation, a child of the late 13th century, when Scotland's breath was heavy with grief. The land that had nurtured generations of proud clans had been broken by the iron grip of Edward Longshanks, the English king whose ambition was as relentless as his cruelty. For Wallace, childhood was not a season of innocence, but an initiation into the harsh reality of what it meant to be Scottish under English rule. The household that raised him was one steeped in both faith and hardship. His family, like so many others, bore the constant weight of English intrusion. Meals were modest, often little more than coarse bread and broth, yet every bite carried with it the bitter taste of taxation that robbed them of their labour. Even in the small comforts of hearth and kinship, the shadow of domination loomed. To be born Scottish was, from the very first breath, to inherit a burden of suspicion and scorn. English soldiers roamed freely, and even the youngest children grew up learning to shrink away from the sight of their banners, instinctively understanding that these men were not protectors, but predators cloaked in armour. As Wallace grew, his education was not confined to books or prayers, but was written into the landscape around him. He saw neighbours driven from their land, homes reduced to smoking ruins, and families begging for scraps in the marketplace. He listened to whispers of women violated by soldiers, of men dragged away in chains for the smallest acts of defiance. He learned that the English crown did not simply conquer territory, it sought to conquer dignity itself. This was racism, codified into daily life, a hierarchy enforced at sword's edge, where to be Scottish was to be marked as lesser, unworthy, disposable. These lessons came not in the form of lectures, but in the scars etched onto the people around him. Each wound a testament to the cruelty of the occupier. The Wallace family, though modest in standing, carried pride in their heritage. Around, the hearth, Elders spoke in hushed tones of Scotland's ancient freedom, of the days when their land was ruled not by foreign kings, but by their own blood. These stories were dangerous, for to speak of Scotland's sovereignty was to invite suspicion, but they were the lifeblood of a people, refusing to forget who they were. For young William, they were seeds of identity, teaching him that he was not merely a subject of oppression, but an heir to a proud lineage that had once stood unbowed. Each tale became a quiet act of resistance, preserving memory in a world determined to erase it. But childhood was also marked by loss, for few families in those years escaped unscathed. Disease carried by poverty and hunger claimed many, while English violence claimed more. Wallace himself would grow to know grief intimately, watching kin and friends vanish under the weight of injustice. To lose a loved one in such times was not only a personal wound, but a political one. It was a reminder that every life taken was part of a larger effort to break Scotland's spirit. For a boy becoming a man, these sorrows forged an iron within him, teaching him that survival alone was not enough. Dignity must be defended, even if it demanded the highest price. As William entered his youth, he grew into a figure marked not only by stature, but by an intensity that set him apart. The English crown had sought to breed submission into every Scottish heart, but Wallace absorbed each insult, each act of violence, and allowed it to harden into resolve. While other boys his age busied themselves with the small joys of childhood, he carried the weight of his people's humiliation like a second skin. His education, though limited by circumstance, was sharpened by necessity. He learned to observe, to remember, to understand the language of power written in the sneers of English soldiers and in the bowed heads of his countrymen. It was a lesson, not found in parchment or scripture, but in the raw theatre of domination that unfolded before his eyes each day. The landscape itself became his classroom. In the woods and glens, he found refuge from the suffocating presence of occupation. The forest whispered of freedom, its vastness untouched by foreign banners, its silence unmarred by English command. There, he trained his body, wielding the weapons of his ancestors, not in defiance yet, but in preparation. Strength became his prayer, resilience his creed. Wallace was not alone in this. Other boys, too, honed their skills in secret, driven by an unspoken understanding that the world they inherited was broken and that their generation might be called to mend it. In every swing of the sword, in every climb across the rugged highlands, Wallace was sculpting himself into more than a man. He was becoming a vessel for his people's buried fury. But it was not only in strength that he grew, it was in conviction. Wallace's soul, shaped by faith and fury alike, came to understand that the English crown's treatment of the Scots was not merely a political conquest, but an attack upon the very essence of humanity. To be called lesser, to be denied dignity, to be forced into silence, these were assaults deeper than the lash of any whip. They were assaults upon the soul. In every sneer cast at his people, Wallace saw the face of injustice, and in every injustice, he found fuel for a fire that could not be quenched. His life, from its earliest moments, was not about seeking comfort or peace, but about grappling with the question of what it meant to live with honor in a world that denied his people the right to even exist as equals. And so, as the years carried him from boyhood to manhood, William Wallace emerged not simply as another Scot living under English chains, but as a spirit carved by suffering and sharpened by remembrance. His body bore the strength of a warrior, but his heart bore something far greater: the unyielding conviction that no people, however beaten, however humiliated, were born to crawl. His life had been shaped by loss, by the daily indignities of occupation, by the endless reminders that his people were considered lesser. But instead of breaking him, it forged him. Instead of silence, it gave him a voice. Instead of despair, it gave him defiance. In him lived the rage of generations, waiting for the moment when one man's will could ignite a nation. By the time he reached manhood, Wallace was already more than flesh and blood. He was a question burning in the hearts of his people. How long can a nation endure chains before it rises to break them? His early life had given him no answer, only scars. But scars can be dangerous things. They remind the living of wounds inflicted, of pain endured, of debts yet unpaid. And in Wallace, those scars did not fade. They sharpened into purpose. Scotland had been pushed into silence, but Wallace was destined to break that silence with a roar. By the dawn of the 14th century, William Wallace was no longer the wide-eyed boy who had wandered Scotland's forests in search of freedom. He had become a man forged by hardship and tempered by the unrelenting weight of oppression. His frame, tall and commanding, carried the presence of one who had lived not for ease, but for survival. His voice, once quiet in childhood, had grown to bear the authority of conviction, sharpened by the stories of injustice etched into his memory. Every market square he entered, every road he travelled, bore the marks of English domination. Foreign soldiers standing guard over trembling villages, taxes wrung from hands that had nothing left to give, punishments dealt with cruelty, so public that they were meant not simply to discipline, but to humiliate. To live under English rule was to breathe in submission with every breath, and yet Wallace refused to inhale it quietly. The English, in their arrogance, underestimated the spark that injustice can kindle in the human soul. They believed they could break Scotland into obedience by branding rebellion as treason, by punishing defiance with gallows and flame. They did not see that their cruelty was not erasing resistance but birthing it. Wallace, who had lived his youth in the shadow of humiliation, now stepped into manhood with fire in his blood. He would not allow his people to kneel forever. His first acts were small, born of necessity rather than design, defending fellow Scots from harassment, striking back at soldiers who mocked or brutalized his kin. These acts, whispers at first, spread like rumor through the villages. There was a man who dared to fight back. Where others had bowed, he had stood tall. Where others had wept in silence, he had raised his hand in defiance. But every act of resistance came with a cost. The English crown, intolerant of rebellion in any form, swiftly labelled Wallace an outlaw. To be outlawed was not simply to be hunted. It was to be erased from the protection of law itself, to be considered less than human, a beast to be captured or slain at will. Yet the title of outlaw, meant to isolate him, only magnified his legend. Among the Scots, the very word carried a different meaning: freedom. Outlawed he might be in English eyes, but to his people he was becoming something greater, a symbol of the unbroken spirit they had buried beneath fear. The tension between Wallace and the English crown grew in the silence of nights, when soldiers hunted him through the woods, in the whispers of villagers who hid him at great risk, in the prayers of mothers who dared hope that his courage might one day free their sons from chains. His existence became a story carried on the wind, told by firelight, passed from mouth to mouth, as though it were both a warning and a promise. England's hold was not absolute. His defiance struck deeper than any sword, for it awakened a buried truth in every Scot, that they too still possessed a voice, still possessed a right to rise. The years of Wallace's early manhood were painted with struggle, secrecy, and survival. He could not yet know how history would remember him, nor could he foresee the price that rebellion would demand of him. But one truth guided him with unwavering clarity. Submission was no life worth living. To endure chains was to deny the dignity of existence, and Wallace had lived too long under the gaze of a conqueror to accept such a fate. His name had already been marked by the English as traitor, as criminal, as enemy of the crown. But to the land he called home, to the people who whispered his deeds in the dark, he was becoming more than a man. He was becoming Scotland itself, embodied in flesh and fury. And so the stage was set. The boy who had witnessed injustice had become the man who would challenge it. The forest that once sheltered him had become the stronghold of resistance. The scars of humiliation had become the fire of resolve. Wallace was no longer a witness to history. He was ready to seize it, to shape it with his defiance, to carve it with his sword. England's banners flew high, its armies marched with confidence, and its rulers believed Scotland to be subdued. But beneath, the weight of chains, a nation stirred. In Wallace, that stirring found a voice, and in that voice, the seeds of rebellion were sown. The setup was complete, but the storm had only begun. The shadow of rebellion did not fall upon Scotland all at once. It grew in whispers, in hidden sparks that kindled into flame, in the silent oaths sworn beneath starless skies where men gather. Ed with hearts pounding, knowing that if they failed they would die nameless, but if they triumphed, they might give their children a world free of chains. William Wallace, branded an outlaw, hunted like a beast, became the rallying point for these whispers, for these sparks. And in him they saw not simply a fugitive, but a mirror of their own suffering. A vessel into which they poured their rage, their despair, and their desperate hope. His rise from hunted man to leader of men was not ordained by crown or parchment, but by necessity, by the urgency of survival in a land where every act of submission deepened the wound, and every act of defiance promised healing. The first blows he struck against England were small, almost trivial in the eyes of kings and sheriffs. An ambush on a tax convoy, an attack on a garrison isolated in the hills, a sudden strike against soldiers who thought themselves untouchable. Yet these acts were more than victories of arms. They were victories of spirit, for they proved that England's grip was not absolute, that its mailed fist could bleed, and that its arrogance could be cut down. With each strike, Wallace grew bolder, his band of followers swelling from a handful of desperate men to clusters of villagers, farmers and fugitives who would rather risk death at his side than endure life under tyranny. And so, rebellion, once unthinkable, began to breathe. It surged through the glens, through the hidden paths of forests and the dark corners of taverns, carried by word of mouth, passed with reverence and urgency, as though Wallace's very name was both a prayer and a weapon. The English, accustomed to seeing Scots as divided and docile, began to sense the unease. Garrisons doubled their patrols, lords tightened their watch, and whispers of the outlaws' victories travelled farther than England cared to admit. But repression only fed the flame. Each punishment inflicted by the crown, each execution designed to terrify, instead hardened resolve, and each man who fell in resistance gave rise to two more who would take his place. Wallace himself did not seek glory in these years. He sought only to strike, to bleed the oppressor, to show his people that they were not helpless. Yet as the months passed, as skirmishes turned into battles and victories mounted, the name William Wallace ceased to be that of a man and became that of a legend. Mothers whispered it to frighten children as a promise that justice lived. Fathers sharpened old blades and carried them into the night, determined to fight under his shadow. For England, what had been a nuisance, was becoming a plague, a force too widespread to stamp out with gallows or fire. Wallace, who had once been hunted, was now the hunter, and the very land itself seemed to rise with him, forests shielding him, rivers carrying him, mountains echoing with his defiance. The rising action of his story was not merely his ascent, but Scotland's awakening, and as the storm gathered, the English crown realised with dawning fear that this was no longer rebellion in the margins of history, it was a war that would demand their full wrath. And so the months bled into years, and with each turning season, Wallace's rebellion swelled like a tide, no longer confined to scattered strikes, but converging into a force that even the English crown could not dismiss as mere brigandage. Villages that once cowered beneath the shadow of English garrisons now rose in open defiance, emboldened by tales of Wallace's victories. Their walls of thatch and stone became rallying points where men, armed with little more than pitchforks and faith, gathered to pledge their lives to the cause. England's soldiers, once feared as invincible agents of the crown, found themselves hunted in the very land they sought to control, their patrols ambushed on narrow passes, their supplies stolen, their arrogance shattered. The air of inevitability, that had cloaked English rule began to fray, replaced by dread, and in that dread lay the power of Wallace's campaign, for it was not merely the clash of steel, but the collapse of certainty. At Stirling Bridge, where the swollen River Forth narrowed and the English sought to crush the Scots once and for all, Wallace turned cunning into a weapon sharper than any blade. There, on that narrow crossing, the English marched in their thousands, their armour gleaming, their banners proud, believing their numbers alone would break the rebel spirit. But Wallace understood the land, understood the folly of their overconfidence, and with patient cruelty he let them cross until their ranks were stretched thin, vulnerable, trapped by their own hubris. Then the Scots struck, and in that thunderous charge the myth of English invincibility shattered like glass beneath a hammer. The river itself became a grave as armoured knights toppled into the waters, dragged down by the very weight of their pride, while those who remained on the bridge were cut down mercilessly, their cries echoing into the hills as a warning to all who dared believe the Crown's might was beyond challenge. The victory at Stirling did more than win a battle. It ignited a fire across Scotland, a fire that burned in every hearth and whispered in every wind, declaring that freedom was not a dream but a living possibility. Wallace's name soared higher than ever, etched into the soul of the nation, and with it came the intoxicating taste of hope. Yet with hope came the gaze of an empire wounded, humiliated, and thirsting for vengeance. Edward the Thus, the hammer of the Scots, no longer viewed Wallace as a nuisance, but as an existential threat to his dominion, and with that recognition came the promise of unrelenting wrath. For Wallace, victory had brought both glory and doom, for the higher he rose, the more relentless the storm that gathered against him. And still he fought, tireless, unyielding, knowing that each triumph was both a salvation and a curse, for, in his defiance he had given his people something worth dying for, and in giving it he had sealed his own fate. Dragged through the mud and filth of London's streets on that fateful August day of 1305, William Wallace was no longer a free man, but a spectacle, paraded as if he were not flesh and blood, but a symbol to be broken before the eyes of all who dared dream of defiance. The crowd jeered, throwing refuse, spitting, cursing his name as though their hatred could erase his victories. Yet beneath the venom there was also awe. This was the man who had once made England tremble, now bound, shackled, and destined for a death so cruel it would sear itself into memory. He was stripped naked, chained to a horse, and dragged for miles, his skin tearing against the cobblestones, every stone cutting deeper until his body was painted red with his own blood. At Smithfield, the stage of horror awaited. He was hanged, not to the mercy of death but to the brink, his body convulsing as the rope tightened, only to be cut down before the release of darkness could claim him. What followed was worse than death itself. He was mutilated alive, his belly split open, his entrails pulled before his very eyes, each agony a deliberate message that no Scot should dare raise his hand against the crown. Still, even as he gasped for air, his spirit refused to yield, his silence heavier than screams, his presence more defiant than words. The knife carved not only his flesh, but his legend. For cruelty this calculated cannot extinguish belief, it only forges it deeper. Finally, his body was quartered, his limbs sent to the corners of Britain, nailed to gates and bridges as grim trophies of royal vengeance, while his head was spiked on London Bridge, a grisly warning meant to end rebellion forever. Yet in that moment of brutal climax, something irreversible occurred. The attempt to erase Wallace immortalized him. Every lash, every cut, every insult became not just a punishment, but a testimony, a story retold by those who saw, those who heard, and those who carried his memory back to Scotland. The English crown thought it was destroying a man. Instead, it was creating a martyr, a ghost that would haunt their dominion and ignite a fire in generations to come. Wallace's flesh was gone, but his defiance lived on, not in castles or parchment, but in the very blood of his people, for cruelty may kill the body, but it cannot kill the idea of freedom once it has taken root. In the silence that followed, his execution, England believed it had stamped out the flame of rebellion, but instead it had lit a fire that no sword could extinguish. The limbs nailed to distant gates and the head rotting on London Bridge were meant to terrify. Yet they became relics of defiance, whispered about in every tavern, every church, every hidden corner where Scots dared to dream of freedom. Wallace's death did not end the struggle. It deepened it, transforming one man's resistance into a people's cause, binding clans divided by rivalry into unity forged in shared grief and fury. Within less than a decade, Scotland would rise, again under Robert the Bruce, and though the wars that followed were long and bitter, they carried within them the memory of a man who had faced the unthinkable without bending. Even today, centuries later, Wallace's end remains one of history's most infamous acts of cruelty, not because it succeeded, but because it failed. The very execution designed to erase him carved his name into eternity, proving that tyranny may silence a voice, but it cannot silence an idea once it has been spoken in blood. And so, the question echoes through time. When the world demands your submission, when power tries to grind dignity into dust, will you bow or will you stand? As Wallace did, unbroken even in the face of death.